The roar of rotor blades drowns out the screams as a red helicopter descends into a suburban backyard. A woman lies motionless on a stretcher. Two paramedics sprint across the grass. A furious neighbor stands at the fence, screaming into her phone. There's a helicopter in the neighborhood. Unauthorized. Get the cops down here now. The camera pans from her horrified face to the whirling blades, and then to flashing police lights racing up the street. I never thought I'd hear a helicopter land in my backyard, not unless I was dreaming or dying. But that morning, it was all too real. The thump of the blades, the wind ripping through our trees, the grass flattening in waves like it was afraid of what was coming. It all started when my wife collapsed in the kitchen. One minute she was reaching for the coffee, the next she was on the tile floor, struggling to breathe. I yelled her name, but her eyes wouldn't focus. She was clammy pale, her pulse erratic. I called 911. The dispatcher asked questions I could barely answer. Paramedics arrived in 7 minutes, but it felt like 70. After assessing her, they told me she needed to get to the trauma center immediately, but ground transport would take too long. There was no time to wait. They called in an air medevac. I remember standing outside with one of the EMTs as he relayed coordinates over his radio. He pointed to the backyard. That's the safest LZ we've got. Keep people clear. I did exactly that. Cleared the yard. Closed the gate. Warned the neighbors. Well, most of them. About 5 minutes later, the noise started, a dull thump in the distance that grew louder by the second. The air changed before the helicopter was even visible, like the atmosphere was bracing itself. Then I saw it. A red medical chopper cutting through the sky, angled straight toward us. But the moment those blades appeared over the rooftops, something else happened. Across the street, Karen stepped out of her front door, bathrobe flapping in the wind, phone already in her hand. She stood frozen for a beat, staring. Then she exploded into action. She marched toward my fence with that signature mix of rage and entitlement. What is happening? You can't just land aircraft here, she screamed over the roar. I tried to tell her, shouted, even that it was a medical emergency. That it was my wife. That every second mattered. But she wasn't listening. She pulled out her phone and began recording, narrating like it was some kind of neighborhood horror story. I'm in the Crestview Estates, and there's a rogue helicopter landing next to my property, she yelled into the phone. Unauthorized airspace violation. Possibly drugs. Possibly filming something illegal. This is against the HOA rules. I stood there stunned as she turned the emergency into a personal vendetta. The paramedics rushed past us toward the house. Karen tried to stop them, blocking their path for a split second before one of them shouted, "Move," and pushed through. She didn't like that. Karen stormed back to her driveway, still on the phone, still shouting. Yes, yes, police. Get them here now. There's a massive safety violation. There's a helicopter in the neighborhood. It's right in his backyard. And that's when the sirens started. Faint at first, then building. Getting closer. The helicopter touched down just as two paramedics emerged from the house, carrying my wife on a stretcher. Her face was pale, unmoving. My heart was a war drum in my chest. Every second was life or death. Karen watched from behind her fence, jaw slack, but still filming. Then, through the swirling dust and roaring blades, I saw the flashing blue lights of two police cruisers tearing up the street toward us. She had actually done it. She'd called the cops on an emergency medevac, and they were coming in fast. The police cars came in hot, sirens screaming, tires skidding as they pulled up to my front curb. Doors flew open. Two officers jumped out, hands near their belts, scanning the scene like they'd just been called to a hostage situation. The wind from the helicopter hadn't even died down yet. Grass and dust were still kicking up as the paramedics loaded my wife into the bird. I was yelling over the roar, trying to explain. One of the EMTs looked up from the stretcher and screamed, "We're on a medical emergency. Lifeline. Clear a path." The taller officer looked at me sharply. What's going on here? Stepped back from the aircraft. I tried to respond, but Karen beat me to it. She came rushing up from her driveway, arms flailing, phone still recording. "This man is landing helicopters in our neighborhood without a permit," she shrieked. "He's breaking multiple codes. This is not a designated air zone. He's putting lives in danger." There are kids here. The officer turned to her. Ma'am, who are you, and why did you report a criminal operation? Karen held her phone up like a badge. I'm a resident, HOA board treasurer, and I have it all on video. This is clearly illegal. What if this is for drugs? Or filming some stunt? They didn't file with the HOA. I stood between the officers and the helicopter, heart pounding. My wife collapsed, I said. She stopped breathing. Paramedics said she needed a trauma center now. That chopper is a medevac. You can check the 911 call logs. We didn't have a choice. One officer narrowed his eyes, then tapped his shoulder radio, asking dispatch to confirm. His partner moved closer to Karen. Did you see anyone doing anything suspicious? He asked her. Weapons, drugs, any visible threat? Karen hesitated, faltered for a second, then tried to double down. No, but look at this. This is a violation. That's a helicopter landing in a residential zone. The officers were trained, but you could see it in their faces. They were already realizing what this was. No crime, no illegal flight, no threat, just a desperate man trying to save his wife. Meanwhile, the medical team had no time for the noise. They locked the stretcher in place, did one last vitals check, then gave the signal. The crew at the rotors responded immediately. The pilot gave a thumb up. The blades began spinning faster. Wind exploded across the yard again. One of the cops took a step back, turning toward his cruiser. The other looked at Karen and said, Ma'am, this is an authorized medical transport. You just triggered an emergency response over a misjudgment. That's a serious issue. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. You could almost see the words forming and then falling apart in her head. Her phone slowly lowered. She tried one last swing. Well, they didn't inform the HOA. The paramedics didn't stop to hear her. They climbed in beside my wife, who was pale but breathing again, her chest rising slowly under the straps. The helicopter lifted an inch, then two, then surged into the sky like it knew it didn't belong here any longer than it had to. Grass flattened again. The whole house rattled from the liftoff. Karen took a few steps back, her robe flapping like a broken sail. I watched the red and white chopper disappear into the blue, swallowed by the morning sun. The sirens were off now. The officers were quieter. One of them approached me, this time calmer. We're sorry. Dispatch just confirmed everything. The medevac was authorized. She's in good hands. You did the right thing. I nodded, jaw clenched to keep from breaking. The moment it hit that my wife was actually in the air, fighting for her life, I felt like I could barely breathe myself. Karen stood stiffly behind the fence, still holding her phone but no longer recording. Her confidence had drained like air from a balloon. She didn't apologize, didn't say a word, just stood there trying to convince herself she hadn't done something terribly wrong. The officer walked back toward her. We'll need a full statement about the nature of your call, ma'am. False alarms waste critical resources. She blinked. But I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. He didn't reply. The street was quieter now. Just the distant hum of traffic. No wind, no blades, no sirens. But the chaos wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I stood in my driveway, staring at the empty sky. The red helicopter was gone now, just a faint hump somewhere above the tree line. My wife was inside it. That machine was her only shot. The police were still parked out front, sorting out the mess Karen had made. One officer stood with his notebook, flipping through pages. The other was talking to dispatch again, probably verifying the flight codes and the hospital transfer log. Karen hadn't moved much. She lingered near her fence, arms crossed now, as if folding herself into silence would undo everything. But her face still twitched with frustration. She didn't look sorry. She looked insulted, like she'd just been left out of a secret she wasn't supposed to miss. You're going to let them get away with that? She asked, loud enough for the officers to hear. A helicopter in a neighborhood? That's not normal. That's not allowed. The younger officer turned toward her. Ma'am, your report was inaccurate. You called in an emergency based on speculation. That wasted time we could have used on a real threat. You're lucky it didn't delay her evacuation. Karen scoffed. So now we just let people run wild with aircrafts? What's next? landing jets on rooftops. He shook his head and walked away. I could tell she wasn't finished. She walked over to me, now that the cops were distracted, and said in a low voice, "You could have notified the HOA. You caused panic." I looked at her. My wife was dying. She flinched but held her ground. "There are protocols. You didn't follow them. That matters." I didn't respond. There was no point. She wasn't listening for understanding. She was listening for an opening to be right. Later that afternoon, after the officers left and the street returned to its quiet suburban rhythm, a few neighbors came by. Some had heard the noise. Others had seen the flashing lights. Most of them asked if everything was okay. I told them what had happened. I kept it simple: emergency, no time medevac. Most nodded, wide-eyed, offering support. But by sundown, whispers started. Karen had already begun spinning her version. She was messaging the HOA board, talking about reckless conduct, about unauthorized use of shared space, about community safety concerns. One neighbor told me she claimed I had helicopters coming in and out of the yard all the time. Another said she told them the police had intervened just in time. The truth was unraveling fast, and she was the one pulling the threads. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA board. Urgent review requested regarding a disturbance involving aircraft in the community. There would be a hearing. Karen was calling it an emergency violation meeting. She wanted consequences. I sat on the edge of my bed, the house feeling heavier than usual. My wife was still in the trauma unit, sedated, undergoing tests. I hadn't even slept. But now I had to defend myself for calling a helicopter to save her life. That night, I got a call from one of the neighbors, Mark, a retired firefighter who lived 3 doors down. He said he'd heard about the meeting and wanted me to know he had my back. "I've called for airlifts before," he said. "You don't wait for permission when seconds count." What you did saved her. Karen doesn't know what the hell she's talking about. I thanked him. I didn't even realize how badly I needed to hear that until he said it. But the storm wasn't over. Karen was rallying her little group, 2 other board members who usually just nodded at whatever she said. She wasn't going to let this go. She saw this as a power grab. The medevac? Just noise in her backyard. The emergency? An inconvenience. My wife's life? A disruption of her morning. The meeting was set for Friday, and Karen was already rehearsing her speech. But I had something she didn't. The truth. And people who saw what really happened. Still, truth alone wasn't always enough in neighborhoods like this. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room wins, and Karen never knew how to keep her voice down. Friday came like a weight pressing against my chest. I hadn't heard much from the hospital overnight, except that my wife was stable, still under observation, still not fully conscious. Every hour felt like a day. But now I had to focus on defending what should have never needed defending. The HOA meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a beige building that looked like it had never seen real conflict until today. I walked in and immediately felt the shift in air. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, papers stacked in front of her like a courtroom prosecutor. 2 other board members sat beside her, both trying to look serious. A few neighbors had shown up too. Some leaned against the walls. Some sat in the folding chairs. Their faces were unreadable. I didn't know who believed what anymore. Karen cleared her throat and stood. "Before we begin," she said loud and crisp, "I'd like to remind everyone that this is a formal hearing. We are here to address an incident that endangered community peace and safety. It's not personal. It's procedural." I wanted to laugh. Not personal. She called the police on a medevac and was now trying to punish me for saving my wife. She turned to me. "You may present your justification." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require volume. I explained how my wife collapsed, how the paramedics called in the helicopter, how there wasn't time to ask for anyone's permission. I told them about the EMTs, the urgency, the diagnosis still pending. I told them what it felt like watching that chopper lift off with a person I loved strapped inside. Some people looked down. Others nodded slowly. But Karen didn't blink. She waited for me to finish, then flipped through her papers. According to HOA Code 4.6c, she said, any modification to residential property that includes vehicular access, airborne or otherwise, must be submitted for approval. Furthermore, Code 3.1a covers noise disturbances, and Code 2.9e prohibits unauthorized use of communal airspace. It was surreal. She was quoting HOA bylaws to criminalize a life-saving moment. I replied calmly, "That wasn't a modification. It wasn't recreational. It was a medical emergency sanctioned by first responders. I have audio of the 911 call and video from my security cameras showing the paramedics' actions." A few heads turned. Karen didn't like that. "Regardless," she said, "your actions caused panic." Children were frightened. Residents were confused. This sets a dangerous precedent. Before I could respond, a voice spoke from the back. It was Mark, the retired firefighter. "Karen, I've worked emergency response for 30 years, he said, walking forward. "You don't wait for an HOA vote when someone's dying. That helicopter saved a life. If it were your family on that stretcher, would you have called for a group consensus too?" Karen looked flustered. "This isn't about my family, but it is," Mark cut in. "It's about what kind of neighbors we are. And frankly, you crossed the line. You called the police and tried to block medics. You wasted their time and risked someone's life over a noise complaint." Another neighbor stood. Then another. One after another, people began speaking. Not loud, not angry, just honest. They'd seen what happened. They knew what it was, and they weren't afraid to say it anymore. Karen tried to push back. She argued rules, guidelines, technicalities. But her voice had lost its grip. She sounded smaller than usual, off balance. The final moment came when the HOA secretary, a quiet man who rarely said anything, finally spoke up. "There will be no violation filed," he said flatly. "This was an emergency medical response authorized by professionals. And frankly, Karen, we'll be reviewing your behavior during this incident next." The room went silent. Karen didn't respond. She just slowly packed her papers and sat down. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just felt tired. Grateful for the people who stepped up, but exhausted by the fact that I had to fight this battle at all. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside into the fading sunlight. The sky was quiet. No blades. No sirens. Just a voicemail on my phone from the hospital. I pressed play. Her voice was weak, but there. She had woken up. The voicemail was only 12 seconds long, but I played it at least a dozen times before I even moved. "Hey, I just woke up," she whispered. Her voice was slow, groggy. "They said you got me here in time. I love you." I didn't realize I was crying until the screen blurred and I had to wipe my eyes just to hit replay. That was all I needed. Not a courtroom. Not an apology. Just that voice. Still alive. By the next morning, I was sitting beside her hospital bed. The tubes were smaller now. The machines were quieter. Her eyes were open. She couldn't talk much yet, but her hand found mine and held on tight. The doctors said if the helicopter had been delayed by even 5 minutes, it would have been a very different story. When she was finally stable enough to rest without machines, I went home for a few hours. I walked into the house like it was the first time in weeks. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet you start to hate after living through sirens and blades and shouting neighbors. I made coffee, sat at the table, thought about the whole thing. Not just the meeting, but the way panic spread faster than facts. How one person with a phone and a title on an HOA board almost disrupted a literal life-saving mission. Later that afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It was Karen. She didn't have her phone out this time. No clipboard. No papers. Just her standing there awkwardly, holding a small box of cookies from the grocery store. "I heard your wife's okay," she said, not making eye contact. I didn't say anything. She cleared her throat. I didn't know it was that serious. She stopped breathing in my arms. Karen looked down. Her hands tightened around the box. "I thought you were doing something reckless," she said. "The helicopter looked dangerous. It scared people." "It scared me." I nodded. "It scared me too." There was a long pause. Then, for the first time, she said it. "I'm sorry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real." And I could see that for all her posturing, for all the HOA rules she clung to, she realized just how wrong she'd been. I took the box, nodded once, and shut the door gently. That was enough. A few days later, the HOA board quietly amended the community guidelines. A new clause was added to the emergency protocols, explicitly allowing authorized medical aircraft landings in urgent situations without prior HOA approval. A direct response to what happened. Permanent change. Karen stepped down from her board position a week after that. The neighborhood started to feel normal again. People waved more. Conversations were friendlier. It's strange how a crisis can reveal who your real neighbors are. The ones who run toward you, not away. The ones who speak up when it counts. My wife came home 2 weeks later, weak but healing, and smiling. We sat in the backyard one evening, just watching the sun dip below the trees. A breeze moved through the grass, the same grass that had been flattened by the helicopter blades. It all looked peaceful now. She looked at me and whispered, "You saved my life." I shook my head. "I just made a call." "No," she said. "You fought for me." Even when people didn't understand, we sat there for a long time, saying nothing else. Just listening. No engines. No sirens. No arguing. Just wind. And breathing. The kind of moment you don't forget. And one you never take for granted again.